In Biographia Literaria, S.T. Coleridge writes about fancy also. He makes comparison between imagination and fancy, fancy and imagination. Coleridge considers fancy to be inferior of the two. As far as fancy is concerned, he states that fancy is inferior to imagination. He does not see it as a creative power at all. It only combines what it perceives into pleasing shapes. So it is not creative, it does not create anything new, but it combines what it perceives into pleasing shapes. Unlike the imagination, it neither fuses nor unifies. It is the arbitrary, voluntary bringing together of things that be remote and forming them into unity. Elsewhere, Coleridge describes fancy as the faculty of bringing together images dissimilar in the main by some one point or more of likeness. In Coleridge's view, fancy is a kind of memory that arbitrarily brings together images which continue to their separate and individual property. Coleridge illustrates his view on the difference between fancy and imagination by citing two passages from Shakespeare's Venus and Adonis. An example of fancy he quotes. I'll give the quotes later and explain them also. But before that, we will make distinction between fancy and imagination. According to Coleridge, first point under fancy. According to Coleridge, fancy refers to the ability to combine and rearrange existing ideas. So fancy lacks originality. There is no originality in fancy. Fancy refers to the ability to combine and rearrange existing ideas, images, or concepts in a mechanical or superficial way without necessarily creating anything new or original. So, fancy is seen as a more superficial and limited faculty compared to imagination. Coleridge views fancy as inferior to imagination for several reasons. Number one, I have explained it lacks originality. Then it's a mechanical process. Fancy operates in a mechanical, associative manner, lacking the creative spark of imagination. No depth or insight. Fancy does not penetrate to the deeper meaning or essence of things, merely skimming the surface. Merely skimming the surface. Fancy has limited scope. Fancy is confined to the realm of existing ideas and experiences, whereas imagination can tap into the infinite and the eternal. So, in contrast, imagination, especially secondary imagination, is seen as a more profound and creative faculty capable of original creation. Imagination can bring into being entirely new ideas, images, and concepts. It is original. Imagination penetrates deep inside. It means imagination penetrates to the heart of things, revealing hidden connections and meanings. Secondary imagination, secondary or primary imagination in general. Imagination is transformative power. Imagination can transform and transcend existing ideas, creating something truly new and original. For Coleridge, fancy is a lesser faculty useful for certain tasks but ultimately inferior to the creative and transformative power of imagination. This is how Coleridge distinguishes between fancy and imagination. Thus, Coleridge considers fancy to be inferior. He does not see it as creative power. It only combines what it perceives into pleasing shapes. It neither fuses nor unifies. It is the arbitrary bringing together of things that be remote and forming them into unity. Elsewhere, Coleridge describes fancy as the faculty of bringing together images dissimilar in the main by some one point or more of likeness. In Coleridge's view, fancy is a kind of memory that arbitrarily brings together images which continue to their separate and individual property. Coleridge illustrates his views on the difference between fancy and imagination by citing two passages from Shakespeare's Venus and Adonis. As an example of fancy, he quotes, "Full gently, you see, full gently now she takes him by the hand, a lily prisoned in a goal of snow, on ivory in an alabaster band, so white a friend, in girls so white a fee." Coleridge points out that the image in these lines, the images do not interpenetrate into one another. The poem is an example of fancy according to Coleridge because it exhibits the following characteristics. It is mechanical combination. The poem combines existing images and ideas like lily, snow, ivory, alabaster in a new way, but without creating a truly original or profound connection. The poem focuses on surface level beauty, using words like white and ivory to create a sense of elegance, but lacking deeper meaning or insight. The images and ideas are not transformed or reinterpreted in a significant way. They are simply rearranged and combined. The poem uses associative thinking, linking ideas through superficial connection, that is, white lily, white snow, white ivory. Coleridge argues that this poem is an example of fancy because it does not penetrate to the deeper meaning or essence of the images. It doesn't create new or original connection between the ideas, relies on surface level beauty and associative thinking. It doesn't transform or transcend the existing ideas. Therefore, he says fancy is inferior to imagination because it's not a creative faculty. Then the example of imagination. Look how a bright star shooteth from the sky, so glides he in the night from Venus's eye. Citing the following lines to illustrate the working of imagination, Coleridge says these lines from the poem transform the image of star shooting from the sky into a metaphor for a person's journey, creating new and original connections. The poem reveals deeper meaning, suggesting a connection between the celestial event and human experience. In these lines, we find that the poem fuses two seemingly different ideas, a star and person's journey, into a new and coherent whole. The poem uses symbolic language. Where the star and Venus's eye become symbols for something greater than themselves. Coleridge argues that this poem is an example of imagination because it transforms and reinterprets existing ideas and images. It reveals deeper meaning and connection between seemingly disparate things. It uses creative fusion to bring together new ideas and employs symbolic language to convey a richer meaning. In contrast to fancy, which might simply combine existing ideas in a new way, these lines use imagination to create a truly original and meaningful connection, revealing new insights and depth. Coleridge remarks how many images and feelings are here brought together without effort and without discord. The beauty of Adonis, the rapidity of the flight, the yearning yet helplessness of the enamored gazer, and a shadowy, ideal character thrown over the whole. Fancy for Coleridge is the drapery of poetic genius because he says that there is combination of three things. There has to be combination of three things: good sense, then fancy, and imagination. Coleridge mentions three faculties required of a poet. Coleridge mentions three faculties required of one is good sense, fancy, and then imagination. He says good sense is the body of poetry, fancy is the drapery of poetic genius. Drapery is like clothes you can take. It is actually a decorative item, but if we are saying good sense is the body of poetic genius, then fancy is the clothes of poetic genius. It is the drapery of poetic genius. But he says that the most important thing he says is imagination is the soul of creative genius, which forms all into one graceful and intelligent whole. That's it. Jai Hind and thank you.